Hello, and welcome to the Natural State Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Gustin. It is my belief that the natural state of any living organism is health, and that our artificial habitat has forced us into having artificial health problems. This show is my attempt to dive deep and learn about using nutrition, sleep, movement, relationships, and more to help you reclaim your natural state of health in a modern world and show you how to thrive in an environment that's stacked against you. If you enjoyed today's show, you can find out more details and information at dranthonygustin.com. This week on the show, I welcome Dr. Ryan DeBell, who is one of my classmates in grad school. We've been very good friends ever since, and we sort of took a bifurcated path about 5-6 years ago, and I focused a lot on nutrition, and he focused a lot on movement and what makes people stay out of pain, physical pain, and the things that you can do to have as much longevity as humanly possible out of your human body. So we get into a lot of details in this show, and man, he is a super smart guy, so it gets a little bit into the weeds at points, but sometimes it's necessary to understand really how your body functions. It's a very complex thing, and there's a lot of practical stuff in here as well. So how people should think about programming, exercise, fitness, and how your body functions for the long haul. So tune into this one, and I hope you enjoy. This episode of The Natural State is sponsored by Ned. Ned is an incredible company that makes a lot of CBD products, and you guys can probably go back to some of my episodes and realize that I have been a CBD skeptic for a very long time. I think that it's really hard in this industry that's exploding to have really high quality products that actually do anything. I tried a bunch of different CBD brands before this one, and unless they had THC in them as well, not enough to get high, but just enough to amplify the effects of CBD, I didn't feel anything until I tried Ned and then was completely blown away. I'd been using their products before they sponsored the show for about 4 to 6 months and have noticed a huge increase the nights that I use their product, about 25 milligrams, so 50 milligrams per night of the CBD. And I sleep way better. But then also the most interesting part is my HRV, as tracked by my Oura Ring, the next morning is about 20 points higher the day that I use CBD versus not. I also have not been doing a lot of social drinking as of this year. So anybody who's been following my stuff knows that I've sort of been taking the backseat to any sort of glass of wine here, drink there, to take the edge off. And the last few months, I'm sure everybody in the world feels a little stressed out. And I've been doing the same amount, like 25 to 50 milligrams, to sort of replace that glass of wine to wind down and de-stress. And it's been pretty remarkable to pull down the edge and make sure that I can just calm down at night with all that's going on in the world. The founders are amazing people. They really care about their supply chain, their sourcing. They do things the right way. And I asked them to hook you guys up with a little bit of a discount code. So if you want to try Ned out, just go to helloned.com/AG15 for 15% off and free shipping. That's HELLONED.com/AG15. That's AG15 for 15% off and free shipping. This show is also brought to you by Alitura Naturals. When I considered sponsors for this show, I reached out to Andy, who is the founder of Alitura, and pretty much begged him to support the show just because they are the only products that I trust to put on my skin. So much garbage is in skincare products that it blows my mind. I cannot find any other products. I do not put anything else on my body other than Alitura. It's actually a lie. I use White Oak Pasture's beef tallow soap in the shower, but other than that, everything sort of pre-post around that is Alitura. And if you don't know why, your skin is the largest organ in your body. It absorbs everything you put on it. And men are less known for using sort of skincare products, but women average over 250 chemicals that are in their bloodstream from their skincare products by the time they walk out the door in the morning. That is ridiculous. I personally use the moisturizer, the clay mask in my sauna, and the Pearl cleanser. My fiance uses way more. She has a little bit more of a skincare routine than I. And the products themselves are made with the highest end ingredients that you would ever find in skincare products. This stuff's incredible. Andy himself is a testament how these products work. He's been on the podcast before to tell his story, but it was amazing. He was in a horrific accident. His face got all mangled up, and he basically made this formula to heal his scars. And he is now a male model. That is not a joke. He has incredible skin and is obsessed with the quality of his ingredients and the sourcing of them. He was just in Hawaii recently sourcing one ingredient of the many that are in one of his products. This guy goes, visits every single farm and product, and it is incredible. The quality you get here is by far the best in the industry. And so I begged him to sponsor the show and also begged him to give you guys a little bit of a hookup. So if you use code AG20, you'll get 20% off in free shipping over at alitura.com. That's AG20 at ALITURA to get 20% off your order at alitura.com. That's AG20 at ALITURA.com. You'll get 20% off in free shipping of your entire order. Again, I use the Pearl Cleanser and the Moisturizer. They are phenomenal. All right, everybody, welcome to the Health
Fit.
Yeah. So anybody who has been paying attention to me or Ryan here for a very long time will know that we previously had a podcast together called the Health Fit Business Podcast. That was a silly time. I think we did, what, I don't know, 50 some episodes?
Yeah, something in that ballpark.
Like 3-4 years ago?
Gosh, yeah, I guess so. I can't really remember exactly, but it's got to be more than 2, less than 5.
Are those still live?
Yeah.
We still have the same 3 people listening?
I haven't looked at the stats, but at least 3, I would imagine.
I think probably at least 2 of them came over to listen to this podcast, which is nice.
Once in a while, I get a message from somebody that they listen to it. So there must be at least a couple, unless they're, they're bots.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe the rush trying to hack into our.
Yeah, it's really important for anybody to spend resources hacking into that.
Yeah. So that, I mean, just to bring it back a little bit, when we met was in grad school, so in Cairo school, and you and I afterwards sort of went in the same direction, but different sides of it. So I sort of focused on nutrition stuff, did a lot of online e-com, making products, things people consume, and you went the whole movement route. And so Health and Business was just trying to help people who are in our same position, who didn't necessarily feel like they were making the impact that they wanted to make or have the lifestyle that they wanted. Being a clinician or a trainer or whatever sort of healthcare professional. But yeah, I mean, things have changed a lot since then. I think that we both started on our journeys about, 5-6 years ago, nearing away clinical practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting, right? Because we get trained in a certain profession or professional skill. And then I think we often limit ourselves into what we think we're actually capable of doing, or we don't even think about it. And, I think Health Fit Business was our attempt to get people to realize that, hey, you can do a lot of things beyond just clinical practice if you have the desire to do that. And if you want to expand your ability to help other people beyond a one-on-one type of scenario, which has been fun. And I think that it's really pushed, I think doing that and having that part of the process and all of our discussions there really refined our thinking and pushed us both to pursue and really see like, well, what can we really accomplish? It's challenging and fun, right?
Yeah. And I think that, so you originally started doing workshops, and that was sort of your tangent away from clinical practice. So what made you want to do that in the first place?
Well, I'm a pylon guy. I'm a pylon guy, meaning I don't try to look so far in the future and think about what are all the steps that I could get to, but rather I always try to look for what's the next obvious step that makes sense, leading in the direction that I want to go. And when I started my clinic, I just did some talks at local gyms to basically just to market my clinic. In the first 2 that I did them every weekend for like 5 weeks in a row. And I emailed out every gym within 20 miles of my clinic. And the first 2 times I went, both of the gym owners said, you should do this as a full day and get people to pay for it because I think you could really help a lot of trainers. And so
is it for trainers or for the actual athletes or both?
At that point, it was for just the actual athletes. And then
like
at the gym
for like certain.
Yeah, it was like, 2 hours of how I felt like people could use some of the tool. Like I felt like that there was a gap where people knew a lot of stretches to do because those are, very popularized on the internet at the time of rolling out and stretching. And then there was also movement assessments like FMS, things like that. But there was nobody that I was aware of translating into practical terms like, hey, if you do this, then you could use these other tools. And so I was trying to connect those disparate sort of schools of thought, at least in my view at the time. And then the first gym owner, he said, man, you should charge this. You could do this and have people from gyms attend. And then the second gal said, you should make a full day where you teach trainers what you think they should know. We'll host it at our gym. And I said, okay, 2 people have told me that. I'm going to listen to that. I kind of have this viewpoint that when I hear the same thing multiple times, it's the universe speaking to me through other people. I mean, which essentially, if you broke it all down, that's actually what it is. And so I did that. And then I started blogging, and I wrote that one blog post about hip anatomy and squatting that got like 1 million page hits in 2 days. And I had 20 invitations to speak at gyms, like literally 3 days later. And so that led down the workshop path and traveling around to different gyms and all over the US doing that, and then into other countries. And I just kept trying to find the next pylon on my path, keep my heading correct and find the next thing to work on.
Yeah. I mean, it's been a crazy path, obviously looking back over the last 5-6 years. I remember that article came out and how wild that was, and how much there was almost like a divisive camp. And like, this is sort of the way that I know that I'm onto something with nutrition work and helping people with health in general, is that when there are intense sides and there's a lot of controversy around it, you're probably on to the right path. And this is something too, where, so the premise of the article, if I remember correctly, is that, people who were popular in the movement space back then saying, hey, everybody needs to squat this the same exact way. You should be able to put your feet shoulder width apart, point them forward, and squat down to this position. And if you can't, then you should smash everything out and get to the pain cave or whatever the hell it was. And make sure that, this is your biggest goal, is to be able to squat like this for however long, or for however many reps. And you just looked at basic fundamental anatomy, comparing bones and bone shape, and saying, well, this is a ridiculous idea. And would love for you to break that down a little bit more as far as just like the variability of anatomy, because I think that this is still a tough thing for people to understand regarding health in general, but nutrition, people, even with all the work I've done in a ketogenic diet, like, I don't think it's the best thing for everybody, or even the people who respond to it well forever. And I think that there's a certain individuality to all things in health. Nutrition is very obvious. Some people can do really well on plants. Some people do really well on all animal diets. There's a lot of spectrum in between. But there are certain foundations of, you should eat real food, and that's sort of non-negotiable. And then within that, there's a lot of individual variability of how somebody thrives. It's the same thing with anatomy as well.
Yeah. Eating real food is funny. I was thinking about this podcast yesterday when I was walking, and I was like, there's really 2 categories of things, right? There's food, and then there's human produced edible products that have calories.
Yeah.
And obviously there's things that are made from, and like, there's a certain spectrum to that of processing, right? And there's such a large end of this where like junk food is just this like edible product that like you can actually kind of digest it. Anyways, so this, the article, when I was like 12 years old and I was really playing a lot of basketball, I could not point my hand forward when I was shooting. And so I had to flare out my elbow to be able to shoot. And literally it was because my elbow does not rotate enough. Like ever since I was a kid, I'm missing like 30 degrees of pronation. And my coach yelled at me. He was like, Ryan, get your elbow in. And I was like, Yeah, I literally can't. And that's why I have my elbow out. So I don't know why you're yelling at me. Anyways, I got in trouble for speaking back to my coach. And so I've always had this sort of emotional, because I've reflected on this article quite a bit, right? And I was like, where did the root did it come from? Because it's sort of obvious once it's laid out, the article, like, it was divisive when it came out. But so anyway, so I had this variant and I still literally can't. And it's the same as when I was a kid. So in my mind, I had always had this appreciation for, I had to vary my form to be able to actually achieve the end goal, which is to shoot the basketball. And then I was deeply doing quite a bit of CrossFit at the time that we were in Chiro school. And I remember in biomechanics class, we were talking about hip version and retroversion and antiversion, which is essentially the way that's measured is if you looked at a femur and if you looked straight down at a femur, you would see the bottom of it, which is where the knee is. And then there's a line that you would draw from that to the angle of the femoral neck and where the head of the femur comes up and off of that. And so between those two lines from a top-down view, you get an angle there, and that's called your version angle. And depending on the size of that version angle, arbitrarily you would be classified as retroverted or antiverted. And so we looked at that in biomechanics course. And I remember looking at that picture because it's this weird drawing, because you're looking at this top-down view, but it's one-dimensional. So it's sort of stacked on itself and it's strange looking. And I thought about that picture for a long time. Like, what the hell am I looking at here? What is this? And it was maybe we talked about it for 10 minutes in class. Then I read this book by Shirley Sarman called Movement Impairment Syndromes. And she said something in that book which was, I think that retroversion is way more common than people think it is. And I went, okay, I'm starting to see something here. And then I was working with these CrossFit athletes, and it was especially in the CrossFit world of the dogmatic approach to how everybody should squat the same, which we'll get into some other reasons, including this hip anatomy reason why that's not true. And I was working with this one athlete, Tia, Tia.
Yeah.
And she was like getting really frustrated with herself because she couldn't squat with that method. And she was having some hip issues. And I did a Craig's test, which is an orthopedic test to try to figure out the version of the femur, because you're trying to feel for the one of the parts of the femur, which when you feel that, it'll tell you the orientation of the femoral head because of the relationship of the femoral head to the neck to I think it's the greater trochanter that you're feeling. And so that'll tell you the angle, which is kind of hard to mentally visualize, but that's what it's, that's why that test will give you that idea. And so it tells you the version of the femur to a degree. And I did that, and I was like, look, I think that you're retroverted. And when you're retroverted, you have to externally rotate what appears to be external rotation when you look at somebody's feet. You externally rotate the hip joint, and that aligns the head of the femur in the socket of the hip, in the acetabulum, in a position that allows for the greatest amount of hip joint flexion. So because it's this three-dimensional shape, and because the bone can be twisted, that means that just because everybody's feet are pointed forward does not mean that the ball of everybody's hip joint is oriented the same in the socket. And there's an orientation that you could put the ball in the socket that will allow for the greatest amount of essentially the femur to go upwards towards your head. And so an antiverted person can do that with their feet pointed forward, and maybe they can even do it with their feet pointed in. Somebody who's retroverted, they'll get blocked because the femoral neck can essentially run into the acetabulum. They have to rotate their hip externally to be able to get into the largest vertical distance in the socket of the femur. And so I told Tia, I was like, just point your feet out like 20 degrees and see. And she squatted way deeper and was like, oh my gosh. And it's like, well, the human body is made up of levers, our bones. And we know there's variations in the lengths of the levers. That's why people have different heights. That's why people have different shoe sizes, and they have, all sorts of differences that we can visually see.
And it's not a hard template where if you have a certain, like if I have a size 11 shoe and your size is 12, it's not like there's roughly 10% difference between your femur length and my femur length, and everything would be fixed in exact proportions.
Yeah. That's a commonly argued thing that I'll address it in one sec, actually, because there's actually a measurement of that. So, we have these differences in the bones in terms of length, which you can visually see. So they're very obvious, right? There's no argument that guy's 7 feet tall, I'm 6 foot, and that guy's 5 feet tall. But there's also variation in some of the aspects of the joints that you won't see until you take the joint to its end range of motion. So there's variation in the version or the twisting of the femur, but you can't see it without moving the joint through its range of motion, and then it gets reflected in that. So that it takes another level of appreciation of, because it's not just visual, you have to watch the movement, and that's more challenging because we see limited movement and we think, oh, it's tightness. We can stretch that. Well, if you look at the research on hip surgeries, they'll do sometimes when somebody's very retroverted, meaning the hip joint or the femur's oriented a specific way, they'll actually do what's called a rotational osteotomy. And a rotational osteotomy is where they essentially change the version of the femur by cutting it and reorienting it. And guess what? The range of motion, especially an internal rotation of the hip joint, which is what you'll lack if you're retroverted, it increases. Of course it increases because they twisted the bone. So we think that, well, somebody has limited internal rotation, they need to stretch. Yeah, but if they have excess of external rotation, because this is what happens a lot when you see somebody who has a retroverted hip, they'll have a ton of external rotation, but they'll have limited internal rotation. And the reason is because range of motion, if you think about it on like if you were to draw on a piece of paper a wedge, and that gives you this full range, like internal would be one edge of the wedge and external rotation is the other end, the whole wedge is shifted if the femur has some sort of version to it. So when they do this rotational osteotomy, they're reshifting the wedge. And so how could you possibly expect that when you take someone to the end range of hip joint flexion, if their wedge is oriented differently, that they're going to be able to do it like somebody who has a different wedge? Makes no sense. Right. So the argument that people make to get to the question that you asked before is people think that, well, it all makes up for itself down the system because, for some reason we expect that a human anatomical system can soak up and make up for everything, which is not true. Because the argument would be, well, the hip joint you have the femur and you have the socket. So the socket makes up for the version of the femur, which would be called acetabular version. That's not true because there's an index called the McKibben Instability Index. And the McKibben Instability Index sums the acetabular version with the femoral version. So it's essentially looking at, does that end up being net zero, essentially? And, well, there wouldn't be an index if it was all the same, right? So the McKibben index tells us that there's this net version, and there is a difference regardless. So whether if your femur is retroverted, you do not necessarily make up for it with a change in the socket. It doesn't work that way. Right.
So different bone shape, different joint position, different anatomy, different expression of movement. Mm-hmm. And, I think that sometimes people get really confused by this because they maybe have experience in their life where they have been tight, they have stretched something out, and they have changed their movement by doing some sort of mobility stuff online. And I don't know how you categorize it, but I sort of think about it as three different ways, where it's either like a neurological limitation, a soft tissue limitation, like the muscles and the fascia are actually limiting, or a joint or a bony anatomy and range of motion difference. And there's definitely a way to assess what differences there are in a joint. And some of them, they're neurological and the soft tissue ones. The neurological one you could train out in 3 minutes by doing some tricks. Soft tissue one, you can, takes many months, but can happen. I've seen it with myself in the last, year or two. And what you're talking about here was that, a lot of times people mistake gross bony anatomy for the other two, if not usually the soft tissue one. How do you think about sort of limitations in movement and how people express them?
Yeah, it's a great question, and a lot of great points that you make there. One of the hardest questions is, and one of the things that I want to make sure people don't, one of the interpretations I don't want people to make is that if you can't do something, blame it on your anatomy, right? I think we should always pursue that we can change something, but if it doesn't change after a year of effort and you're starting to get pain at the end range, like pinching, it's probably because you're painfully pinching the end range. Like if you pinch something over and over and over and over again at the end, and then you have painful pinching in your joint, it's because you have painful pinching in your joint. So you should probably stop doing that. But if you're tight and you work on something for a week and it feels good, then yeah, continue pursuing that. But it's also important to remember that something has to stop the range of motion at some point, right? Like we don't have limitless range of motion in every joint. So I think we have to think about, why do we pursue more range of motion in certain joints in certain ranges? We have to understand what is the final limiter of range of motion. So the final limiter could be the architecture of the joint itself. So for example, if I take my elbow and I straighten it as far as possible, the end result of that is because you have two bones hitting each other, and you're not going to change that. And you don't want to. If I try to bend my elbow as far as possible, I have soft tissue approximation. So my forearm literally, it doesn't run into my biceps anymore because I have no weights and it's quarantine and I'm starting to wither away into a skinny little, yeah. So that would ultimately be limited by soft tissue approximation. If you took my elbow and you pushed it, like how you would do a test for an MCL, the end of that motion is your MCL. So that's basically a passive tissue restraint. So I classify this in two ways. There's active mobility limitation, these terms are so misused and used by so many people in the space differently that like we don't even have agreed upon ways of speaking, which create all sorts of issues. So I think you have active range of motion limitations and you have passive range of motion limitations. The passive ones are things that won't change and are non-contractile. So that would be the architecture of the joint, the bone itself, soft tissue approximation, and passive connective tissue restraints. Those also happen to be the passive stabilizers of your joint. Because if you didn't have those, your body would fall apart. So those are probably not going to change. And there are certain camps that try to pursue stressing the end range to try to get some more. I don't even know if that's worth pursuing. There's many things in life and doing with your body that aren't worth pursuing that you could theoretically do. Right? Like I could stress any skin on my body and it'll develop a callus. But like, why would I do that on my quad, for example? Like, so there's things you can do like that that are nonsensical. And then you have the things that can change. And the things that can change, as you stated, are essentially the neuromuscular system. So the neuromuscular system would be the muscles with the input of the nervous system, both the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. So sometimes when people foam roll, for example, they'll get more range of motion immediately. And the question would be, why does that happen? And there's probably several things. The first thing you're not doing is you're probably not breaking up anything. You might be breaking up actually what are called hyaluronic acid aggregates, which is something I was just reading this article about. Essentially in the ground substance of the extracellular matrix of your deep fascia, you have what's called bound water and unbound water, because hyaluronic acid makes up the ground substance. And if it's unbound, because it is a very polar molecule, if it's unbound, it can actually aggregate and change the viscosity of the of the tissue, supposedly, and potentially make the free nerve endings easier to fire off an action potential. So there was a study done where they took an MRI and they looked at that bound and unbound water before and after a series of fascial manipulation sessions. And they found that there was more bound water, which creates a more slippery high hyaluronic acid ground substance after, and that was correlated with improved function and decreased pain. So not causation, but it's interesting. So there's some local stuff that could be happening. You're also probably stimulating some of the free nerve endings that reflexively go to your spinal cord and then decrease the tone of the musculature. So that would be like a peripheral cause. And then if you have like fear or previous history of pain, you could have this reflexive tightening of the muscle because you're unconsciously trying to prevent putting the joint in a position or taking the tissues to a level of stretch where there's this unconscious neurologic constraint to protect and avoid a certain level of vulnerability.
Yeah.
So that's why doing something like training through a range of motion where there's no pain is one of the best ways to make sure that you have great range of motion. Because you're stressing the tissue in a certain way, you're showing your brain that it's safe to be loaded in that position, and you're showing your brain, or you're basically, I think of it like proving to your mind that you can create strength and support and stability there, and there's no threat of injury or a painful response.
Yeah, and one of the ways that I've worked on this a lot in the last year or two is getting into positions for me that have been extremely tight historically. And like you said, like I don't think people understand that there's a software that controls all of your tissue length way more than the end range of your actual tissues. If your body let you go to the actual end range of your tissues, where like you have tissue integrity, you would rip your tissues all the time. And if there wasn't sort of a backstop to that and sort of a rubber band effect that was controlled by software, aka your brain. And so one of the things I do now is like when I hold positions for a long period of time, I'll squeeze against them in sort of this contract, relax state back and forth. And then when I relax into it at the end, waiting out there for like a minute or 2 minutes and do really, really deep breathing, to sort of activate parasympathetic nervous system and tell my body like, this is a safe position. This nice slow breath indicates that this is not a position that needs to be protected or guarded against. And that's been sort of the biggest thing for me to unlock new ranges of motion, which is all working on the software level, not necessarily the tissue level.
Yeah. And to add to that, so if you look at the some of the research on static stretching techniques, and they try to figure out why is it happening. So in one style of study, for example, what they would do is they would take somebody and put them on a table, and they would put their leg into a harness. And then the harness would be elevated continually to take them into essentially a hamstring stretch. And that participant is given a button, and they're instructed to push the button when they want it to stop. And so what they do is they measure the angle where the person pushes the button. And then they measure the force required to get their leg up to that level. And that essentially gives them, they're able to plot what's called a stress strain curve, and the stress strain curve essentially shows the amount of force required for a unit length of change, which would give you an idea of the actual stiffness of the tissues. Because the idea with static stretching that people have is, okay, I'm doing it because it's making the tissues more flexible. Like if that was the assumption, there would have to be an actual structural change to the connective tissue. Maybe there's more elastin that would somehow be produced by static stretching, or there's maybe layering of a different collagen, because there's different categories of collagen that have different levels of flexibility. But what's interesting, so then they take that person, they put them on a 6-week stretching program for their hamstrings, and they have them come back, they do the test again, and they go farther, and they push the button. But the thing that's interesting is the stress strain curve is the same. So there's no it's not easier to take their leg up. They just don't push the button until farther, because the hypothesis would be because they don't have the painful sensation of the stretch. Because when you haven't taken a tissue to a certain length, you get these stretch receptor signals that go to your brain, and there might be some that go to the spinal cord. I'm not 100% sure on that. I'm sure there are some reflex loops that go to the spinal cord as well. But the hypothesis would be that you're becoming less sensitive to those signals. And so you get into a deeper range of motion in the joint because you're not so sensitive. And stretching is really a desensitization of the nervous system to pulling things to a certain length. Yep. There's a variety of factors that go into why that's the case.
What would be another really interesting thing to do with that same study is to do, they had a before and after of the 6 weeks of stretching. Mm-hmm. Is to do passive range of motion under anesthesia.
Yeah.
Pre 6 weeks, post 6 weeks.
I did a podcast with a guy who's a doctor in Germany because he has 2 doctorates. And if you have 2 doctorates, they actually call you doctor, I guess. And he, because I had that thought, right? And I talked about it on my podcast, and somebody messaged me and said, "Hey, you should talk to this guy." So I talked to him, and he said that, they would be doing a shoulder surgery or whatever, and he would be curious. So he would raise their leg up before and after in surgery he was doing a test of everything before surgery. And then he noticed during the surgery for his shoulder that the nurse for some reason had his leg up. And he was like, "That's strange because I could barely get that thing to 45 degrees. And now the nurse was just holding it straight up with no effort." So then he said he started just testing that on people before and after they went under anesthesia. And that when you put someone under general anesthesia, which gets rid of all of the nerve impulse into the muscle so it can't contract, so you get a real read on the passive constraints, it's way farther, which makes you realize that it is an active range of motion problem. But at some point, even under anesthesia, the joint has to end somewhere, and that's due to the passive constraints, the soft tissue approximation, the architecture of the joint, and the passive things like ligaments and capsules and non-contractile tissues.
So, putting all that all together, there's obviously article we'll link to it. It demonstrates that all people should not squat the same.
Yeah.
What other areas of the body are very obviously dependent on variability of the person? So shoulder, I'm assuming flexion, glenohumeral joint, flexion, extension, things like that. Obviously you have some stuff in the elbow, but more, I guess, generalized ones that you could pretty much count on. You are very different from all the people that probably to some degree, with your squat position. What other positions maybe in a workout that are common?
Yeah, so definitely shoulder flexion, which is well established from a lot of research on overhead athletes, where there's different types of
reaching your arms overhead.
Yeah, reaching your arms overhead that's one I think that even though it's established and not even debated, it's not debated at all, because there are literally different types of acromion processes, which is a part of your shoulder blade that kind of sits over the top of your shoulder. And if you have I think I'm type 2 on my right and type 1 on my left. I have no idea. It's just a guess. But you can also have different orientations of the shoulder socket, and you can have version of the humerus, your arm bone, which is the top of that bone is your shoulder, is the ball of your shoulder joint. And you can have different curvatures of the thoracic spine that are anatomical, because the end of thoracic extension is facet joint compression. So that's why, it's easy to make generalities. It's also easy to say everybody should be able to do this and this and this, but we don't live in a world where humans are robotically produced in a manufacturing facility. So I think that, to answer your question, the most common ones are the hip and the shoulder. Now, there's debate on how common it is, and I'm only familiar with the commonality of it for the hip. And it's somewhere like 10 to 15% of people have some retroversion in their hip joint. So it's not everybody, obviously. But 10% of the world is a lot of people.
Yeah. And like, there's obviously a spectrum from the 90% to the 10%. It's not like it's a yes or no, black or white sort of thing.
No, it's a bell curve, I'm sure.
And then, so there's all this variability, obviously, squatting, reaching overhead, for example, yet there's also a challenge to assess this maybe on your own or with a coach, people who aren't aware. Maybe you're reaching overhead and you go, oh, I can't reach overhead. It must be, my shoulder joint, but yet like you're hunched over and you don't have thoracic extension for whatever reason. You don't have good control of that. How would one go about assessing their body parts? And, this is where I just get confused right now of, when we went through school, it was SFMA, FMS, some of these systems that came out where they were sort of a good framework to think about things, but I don't think very good to actually catch a lot of these individual parameters and giving prescription on how to get through them. You have some newer ones now with, FRC, et cetera. I mean, do you know of any sort of platform that exists for people or some framework that is good enough to get through some of this stuff and like give somebody a, hey, here's where your deficiencies are, an assessment, and like, here's how to get through that for yourself to improve your movement?
I think that's one of the hardest questions, and one of the biggest challenges is, well, I think there's two parts to this. One part is it's very challenging to know that it takes a lot of understanding of the human body, and it's hard to teach a standardized system where there's so much variability.
And nuance.
You're right. It's nuanced. The second part of that question is, why do we have such a desire to try to push all of our joints to the very end of their ability? And what are we trying to gain from that? And I'm assuming we're trying to gain having a very healthy, good feeling body for our entire lives, right? People don't want to lose their range of motion. It's sort of a catch-22, because if you push a joint to its end range of motion a ton and you end up getting pain and, irritating your hip labrum or your shoulder labrum, or you're getting a painful impingement of the tendons in your rotator cuff because you push flexion so much, like what you're trying to do to prevent can actually cause.
Yeah. And then you start developing osteoarthritis over a long period of time because you're overusing the joints when you don't really need to. But yeah, I mean, you and I chat all the time on if one were to construct with the goal, their body to have maximal longevity and be able to function at a high capacity for as long as humanly possible. Like, what does that look like in all these different areas? And this is a question that like a lot of times people just don't look at what they're doing in health or life in general with some sort of perspective of why they're doing it. I think that training is one of these things of, working out, exercising, et cetera, where people get caught into I just need to do it because it's something, a box I need to check to be healthy because my doctor said so, or because it's like, what's that? Or people want to look a certain way, which is totally fine too. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think that like everyone, when it comes down to it, I would hope would want to have their body function for as long as humanly possible. I think like until you have a serious physical injury, when we were playing basketball a couple years ago and I was trying to dunk on you and I fell and broke my ankle. And yeah, I mean, you just don't appreciate the function of your joints. And I think a lot of people, what they don't realize until it's too late is that the body's the only place you have to live, truly. And if your experience is in physical pain all the time, your quality of life degrades rather quickly. Mm-hmm. And this is something that I think people just don't think that far in the future, nor have the knowledge, like you were just talking about, and all the nuance regarding what happens to this joint long term. Is it setting things up for success? And so people end up not knowing anything about running form or training when they're running, and go out and just sloppily jog around for 3 hours, 2 hours, get on a bike, cruise on a bike or a stationary bike, go to a spin class, and just do the same things over and over and over again. So, I know like we've chatted a lot recently about how to set up a training protocol and a program that would allow somebody, or at least put them in a direction of thinking about like, how do I split apart all these systems if my goal was to be as healthy as possible, pain-free, and active to be able to do whatever physical task I wanted to do until as long as humanly possible. Like, what does that look like, and how do you compartmentalize it in your head?
Yeah. I think the personal training profession is supposed to be helping people do that. And the problem is that there's so much background knowledge required about anatomy that I think is not included. That there's a lot of education and thinking required to do that well, right? Like that's why that profession exists, is to give people that one-on-one concierge level of that. But there's obviously a lot of practical things that we can discuss on that topic. Rule number one is don't mess up your joints. Okay. Your joints are super important, and you can build muscle and get tremendous training effects without hurting your joints. But if you try to push your joints see, this is where I think I differ from a lot of people. I don't want to do heavy lifting at the very end range of joints. I want to use my neuromuscular system to stop before the very end of certain joint ranges of motion, primarily the end of spinal motion, hip joint flexion, and shoulder joint flexion. And primarily because there are structures that get compressed that I don't believe will adapt in a way that is beneficial to the longevity of your body. So for example, right, there's this, people always say, oh, we have to squat heavy really low because I saw a picture on Instagram of someone in Asia squatting at the bus stop. So therefore we must do this.
Or glute activation, or loading the nervous system, or all these different things.
Yeah. So if we think about this squatting example, we've created a conundrum for ourselves. On the one hand, we have research suggesting that doing loaded exercises of the low back, where the low back bends a lot, there is a potential mechanism to create damage to a lumbar disc over time. It doesn't mean it will happen, but it's been shown that it could happen. So then one of the ways that we go about preventing that is making sure that people brace and stiffen their spine when they're squatting. But then we ask them to squat as deep as possible, not bending their spine. And the end of that will be compression of the bones together, depending on the variation in the anatomy of the hip. The very, very end of that, because it's basically a bony end to that range of motion. So then what happens? In a normal squat pattern where it's not an exercise, you would naturally let your pelvis rotate. And the pelvis rotating positions the hip sockets in a way where that you won't jam the end of it. But we can't do that, because if we do that and we have weight on our back, it's bad for our lower back. So I would prefer, for my own training, if I'm going to be squatting with a bar or heavy, I don't want to go to the very, very, very end, because I think that is putting me a little bit more on the path to potentially having long-term hip issues, especially for me, because I am retroverted. And I do, if I squat a ton, get impingement in my hip joint. So part of the answer to this is being more aware of your body. There are levels of awareness of your body that you can develop and build. For example, if I'm doing a stretch of my shoulder into flexion, and I think I'm stretching my lats, but I don't feel a stretch in my lats, I feel this kind of pressure on the top of my shoulder. That is you basically not stretching your lats at all, but rather stressing your shoulder joint and maybe compressing certain structures that aren't going to adapt positively to that compression. So building a mind-body awareness of, does this create, training should never create pinching pain. Just that alone will save you so many problems. If you're getting pinching in a joint that's closing, that's a problem, and you should think about a way to modify that. I have a rule, don't push into a pinch. So just doing that, right? So like, for example, if I was going to squat and I'm getting pinching in my hip at the very end, I'm just going to squat not as deep. And then somebody might say, well, I read that, you don't get as much glute activation, and well, then go do some accessory glute exercises. What are you going to do? Are you doing a glute competition? No, you're trying to keep your body strong and healthy, preserve your joints, not stress them, bang, bang, bang at end range with a ton of weight.
Yeah. Like Trump says, like there's only so much exercising you can do before. So only so many deep squats you can do before you retire. And that's why he's so energetic.
Interestingly enough, though, paying attention to your energy levels when you're training hard is important. Like, there's a fine balance there too, where I think people, their energy levels drop substantially because they're overtraining and they're under eating. And, you should feel good and energetic from your workouts, not drained. You shouldn't feel pinchy and painful. Like muscular soreness is definitely okay. But it's just these basic rules.
Second wind and collapsed on the floor. Like we just did a 500 meter
rep. Well, look, I think about it like this. Sometimes when I'm meditating, I'll do this. I'll try to like meditate. And then when I open my eyes, I look down and I try to like, in Avatar, when he first wakes up in his avatar body.
No.
Okay. Well, anyways, for everyone else in the world who's watched Avatar. So there's a moment when Jake Sully wakes up in his avatar body and he looks at his hand and he's like, whoa. I think about the human body like that. Okay. I have my assumptions about this thing because of all the stuff I've read and all the people that have written books and blah, blah, blah. But if I tried to look at it from a blank slate of, okay, I have this body that I didn't ask for, but here it is. What do I know about it? How are the joints shaped? Why is everybody doing these exercises? Are they actually doing what I want them to do? Are they actually doing what's needed? What is needed? Like you have to get to these root problems to figure out everything and not follow a dogmatic approach. So there's a lot of, things that could be cut out. I think there's things that should be added that most people aren't doing, like more locomotion, which is basically moving your body in space from one place to another. And there's a variety of ways to do that versus most exercises are your body is in one place and you're moving it in the one place, like a deadlift. You're not moving your body in space. You're moving within your body and you're moving weight. But for so much of human history, if you think about it from like a sapiens type perspective of how we would have used our body before modern times, hard to imagine most of what we did physically was not moving our body in space or moving our body plus a load from point A to point B. And that is not how most training is done in the gym. It's done. And I think a lot of training that's done in the gym can support that and it should support that. But I think that we're missing a big piece if we're not including a lot of walking, running, jumping, etc. Those are very, in my opinion, fundamental.
Yeah. You're trying to get me to run more recently, and I haven't done much running in the last few years, and it's something that I'm not a huge fan of. And sort of my argument against it was like the way I understood it was more of okay, you're putting this demand on the cardiovascular system and training that, which I get a lot in my other training. And so, for instance, one of the first runs you programmed for me, I went out for 5 miles. In the week before that, I did sort of a really fast 2 miles just to see where my capacity was at. And it was fine. I hadn't run in a couple of years. And so this is sort of like feeds back into my thought process of running's not important because it doesn't, like, I have the cardiovascular capacity by doing all these other things that also train different systems in conjunction. You have a really good argument regarding how running properly and, not sort of the way most people, when you go out and see them just sort of slogging around for as long as they can. So yeah, I'd love for you to talk about sort of like your thought on running programming and why it's important for people and how they should think about incorporating it in their training as a part, hopefully, and not, again, I think people are very unimodal here, where they just think I should, Ryan says running is good, I'm just gonna go run now, and don't do all these other things.
Yeah. I look through all of this stuff at the lens of, okay, this body that I have, I want it to be able to do as much, I don't want it to ever decrease my quality of life. I want it to be able to move me around and, that kind of a thing, right? Keep it as healthy as possible and as functional as possible for as long as possible. So one of the arguments I have for doing more locomotion type of work is that as people get older, what's one of the things that we can look around literally and just observe? They have a hard time even walking down the street. So what's the other end of the spectrum of walking? It's running fast. So if I want to, again, this is my approach on it. If I want to make sure that I can walk and move freely, it would make sense to me to push that ability towards the end of the spectrum for as long as I could in a way that's not damaging to myself, which would be making sure that I'm training running. Because as running degrades, it leads to, if you can't run, but you can walk, where do you think that goes?
Yeah, sort of like if you can't, lift 150 pounds off the floor, how do you think your ability to lift 50 is also going to diminish? And that'll, exactly. Your capacity will change as well.
Exactly. I mean, in a deadlift, it's the obvious thing is weight. In locomotion, it's sort of like speed and
moving your own body through space.
Yeah. It's like the quote unquote heavier it is sort of like the faster or the longer that you can do it. But that's not the only form of locomotion too, right? There's sled pulls. There's forward and backward sled drags. There's jumping, climbing on monkey bars. That's locomotion. You're just using your arms instead of your legs. Doing rope climbs. Again, that's moving your arms instead of your legs. But the thing that most people don't get if they're just doing strength training is your feet. The feet and the calves get so undertrained in most strength training programs. The ability to absorb the load in the foot, to spring back up. I think losing that springiness is really crucial to try to prevent. So, that could just look like doing some basic jump roping, alternating step jumps where you're literally just kind of running in place, single leg jumps, double leg jumps. I think that should be included as well.
Triple unders.
If you want to do triple unders, that kind of, again, pushing it towards the end of the spectrum. Now, for actual running programming, and I've had the opportunity to pick the brains of some of the people that I consider to be the most intelligent people on running programming, like Jay DeSherry and Chris Johnson are two guys that I've learned a ton from. And one of the things that I've picked up on and incorporated myself is the importance of foot strength and the ability to create tension with your big toe down into the ground, because that essentially guides the force created from the leg muscles, sort of like as the rotator cuff of the lower extremity in terms of it's the thing that actually guides the force and transfers it from your body to the ground. And then with running at different speeds for different distances. So not always running the same distance, the same route at the same pace. Having some days where you're running faster. Maybe that looks like 1 minute of hard running, 4 minutes of walking. Maybe it looks like 30 seconds on, 2.5 minutes off, things like that. And then having a mid-range where maybe you're running for 5 minutes continuous, 7 minutes continuous. So 7 minutes on, 3 minutes off. And then having actual longer single runs. And my understanding of a lot of research on running is that there's if you run once a week, the risk of injury is sort of higher. If you run 7 days a week, it's higher. And then if you run 2 to 3 or 4, it's actually lower. So it creates this U shape.
Yeah.
And so that suggests that if you're going to do running training, which, I've laid out my reasons for why I think you should, incorporating it 2 or 3 days a week at varying levels of distance and intensity changes the way that your body gets stressed also. So then you don't overstress the same highest stress point in your running system every single time. So that's kind of the basic way that I would approach doing that. And then I would layer strength training on top of it. Because I've actually moved to really doing most cardiovascular metabolic conditioning in running versus moving weights. Primarily because I think that lower skilled, well, people might say running's high skill, but I think that it's the most tuned way to do that kind of cardiovascular training. I think other things mimic it, like a bike mimics the pattern of running, right? Because it's, the legs are turning in a similar way. And then I would layer strength training on top of it. And there's many ways that you could consider doing strength training, because with all this stuff, there's not one right way. And we talked about that before we started recording, that I think of humans as movement omnivores. People want to argue powerlifting's the best, bodybuilding's the best, conjugate's the best. Do you know how many people in the world have benefited from all of those? Because you're fundamentally following a similar principle, which is stress the body to a point where when you then have time to recover, you get a positive adaptation. There's not one way to do that. There's many ways to do it. But I think there's certain principles that can guide that. For example, you might need a certain amount of time under tension. You may need a certain level of difficulty. If you do something that's too easy, you won't get a positive adaptation. Not stressing the joints at the end range really, really hard, as I mentioned before. Making sure that you're getting enough rest. You have to be fueling correctly, obviously. That's more in your area of expertise. That you could be doing the best workouts in the world, but if you're not putting the right materials inside at the right quantities, that's a problem.
Right.
So
yeah, too much dulce de leche is not good for anybody, right?
What's that?
That too much dulce de leche is not good for anyone.
Yeah, if you come to Buenos Aires and you eat too many empanadas and ice cream and alfajores, and you're in a caloric surplus, you start to visually see that caloric surplus as a mass of bad decisions. That's how I think about it. Oh, this is a reflection of decisions that I made. So I should probably make different decisions.
Your mind is always a treasure of all of these perspectives, my friend. Sure, we could go on forever, but we'll cap it there. Would love for you to chat, though, about where people can find stuff you're doing now. No longer doing workshops, no longer in a clinic, but people can find your work online. So where can they access that?
Yeah. So the main area would be themovementfix.com. There's articles and videos on there, as well as the YouTube channel. So just go to YouTube and type in Movement Fix. There's hundreds of videos. I do a podcast where I talk to experts in a variety of movement areas, like surgeons and stuff. We talk about how surgeries are done and things like that. Yeah, those are the main areas.
All right, my friend. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate you having me on, and I appreciate the questions and the chat.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Natural State Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, I'd really appreciate you heading over to whatever service you're listening to this podcast on, dropping me a 5-star review and your thoughts on the show. This helps us get discovered by more people and spreading the good gospel of health. And if you want to stay plugged into all of my self-health experiments, recent research and books that I'm reading and my interpretations of those things, products that I'm testing and thoughts on all things related to health, check out my free weekly newsletter called The Feed. You can sign up for that at dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. That's dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. Thanks again for tuning in and your support of the Natural State Podcast.